So my name is Leah Tompkins. I am a PhD student at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid here in Spain. So my talk today is titled Demystifying Achievement, and what I'm going to be discussing is students' perceptions of the basis of achievement in different content and language integrated learning subjects. You're going to hear more about content and language integrated learning and what that means in a second in case that doesn't make sense just yet. Um, but the main problem that I'm addressing with my study is one that most of us are probably already familiar with, very familiar with, which is that some students come to school better equipped to achieve than others because they're more familiar with the ways of engaging with knowledge that are valued there. So whether at home or in their previous schooling, some students have simply been exposed to expectations that are similar to those of their current teachers, which makes it easier for them to figure out what's expected of them when this isn't made explicit. And this influence of students' background on their academic achievement can make it very challenging to improve equity because we can't actually change students' background, right? But what we can do is to help teachers to articulate their expectations and make them more explicit and more achievable for all students. So that's the point of departure for my thesis project. And that's what I'm going to be telling you a small piece of today. So, and by the way, since this is a thesis project, especially since this is a thesis project, if you have any comments, questions, feedback, please feel free to actually jump in, like Carl has said earlier, because I really appreciate the constructive criticism as I'm writing up my dissertation. Right. So content and language integrated learning. What is it? Well, I think that it's a particularly powerful example of the possible influence of students' backgrounds, their social and educational backgrounds on their academic achievement, because it's one where where this influence is often contested and discussed in the literature. Um, and content and language integrated learning is a mainstream educational approach in Europe where students learn content subjects like natural sciences or social sciences through an additional language. It could be any language, but it's almost always English as a lingua franca. So while it's a great opportunity for students to gain more exposure to a lingua franca and to become more fluent and more proficient in this language at the same time as they're learning their content subjects, they're also presented with a series of challenges in this endeavor. So the first challenge for students is to engage with subject content in valued ways, which, as we know, is common to all students around the world. But then the second challenge for CLIL students is to do so through English. So because of this, there have been many scholars who have said that CLIL might favor students who can or can afford to develop their English language knowledge outside of school, giving them an advantage over other students. And then the third challenge that CLIL students face is inconsistent assessment criteria. There is still no clear pedagogy for integrating content and language. So some teachers in the literature have been found to implement their own subjective criteria that might implicitly valorize things like fluency and nativeness in language, which can also be linked to student social background. So that is something that's also coming up in the literature a lot, and it's kind of nicely illustrated here in this comic where a CLIL teacher is trying to figure out how to integrate language with all of these other elements of teaching that he's been learning about in his university studies, preparing him to teach CLIL. So where to start? How to tackle this problem? Well, in this scenario, with these students facing these challenges, what matters for achievement might be opaque to students, perhaps more in this case than in other scenarios. So my approach was to first find out how teachers and students were perceiving the basis of achievement in CLIL subjects on as large of a scale as I, a meager doctoral student, had access to. And my idea was to compare their perceptions, because if the basis of achievement were indeed opaque to students, then they wouldn't be perceiving them in the same way as their teachers were. So in order to do that, I turn to, as you can probably guess, the specialization dimension. And I'm looking at how teachers and students perceive the strengths of epistemic relations and social relations in three subjects that are taught through English, where epistemic relations reflect how much what students know matters to do well in the subject, and social relations reflect how much who students are matters to do well in the subject. As you all know, these concepts are typically articulated together to explore different specialization codes, where knowledge codes emphasize what you know, knower codes who you are, elite codes emphasize both, and relativist codes emphasize neither, or sort of an anything goes situation. Now within specialization, I'm also using the 4K model, which offers a more fine-grained analysis of the different kinds of the four specialization codes. So within the 4K model, social relations are distinguished into interactional relations with ways of knowing and subjective relations with kinds of knowers, while epistemic relations are distinguished into discursive relations between knowledge practices and other knowledge practices, and ontic relations between knowledge practices and their objects. If the 4K model is new to you, it's going to be much more concrete here in a second as I talk about my data. So my data come from responses to questionnaires that were administered online to 91 teachers and 772 students in year 10 of a CLIL program in different regions of Spain. These participants come from a cross-sectional and longitudinal research project by the UAM CLIL Research Group, many of whose members are here today, I'm happy to say. Uh, and my study in particular focuses on their responses to an adapted version of Carl and Sarah Howard's instrument designed to measure epistemic relations and social relations in mixed methods research. So this is their original instrument here on the right, where they ask teachers how important the following aspects are to do well in the subject that they primarily teach. And each of these items actually corresponds to one relation in the 4K model. So having natural talent in the subject would correspond to subjective relations, learning content, knowledge, theory, and concepts to ontic relations, learning skills and procedures to discursive relations, and getting a feel for the subject to interactional relations. And then the teachers and the students as well were asked to rank how important these items were from not at all to very. My task for my project was to adapt this to the Spanish context, which involved some translation, which was not actually as easy as I originally thought it would be, because it turns out that getting a feel for a subject area is a very complicated idea to express in Spanish, and there's no one-to-one translation actually. So this ended up, this turned into kind of an endeavor where I consulted with many different people on how to do the translation accurately, consulted with Carl, he offered some feedback, and then I can present you with my version, which is now translated back into English so that you can all read it.
Can I
So
just
these
take
are
a
the,
moment, Leah,
yeah.
to think like, so what you're doing, I mean, in the book that I'm writing, I'm describing this sort of thing where we've come up with a means of translating between the theory and gathering data rather than analyzing data. So the translation device is the one people may have heard about for how to shift between theory and data to show how theory, a concept is enacted in data in terms of analysis. We have this other thing, which I'm calling an activation device, which is a means of being able to activate the concepts in the collection of data, which is what you're adapting here. And just like a translation
Mm.
device, you have to adapt it. It's not written in stone. The one that we came up with for the one that you showed on the previous slide was one that was developed over many years, but it was to do
Mm.
with young kids in secondary schools in New South Wales, Australia. So, of course, yeah, when you go to use it in a different institutional and linguistic setting with a different culture, I mean, it's quite right. You have to adapt it. So, I just wanted to reinforce that point for people, which is things like this, anything like an activation device or a translation device, which moves between theory and data collection, or between theory and data in data analysis. These things have to be adapted because of the specificities of the object of study. In your case, different age students, isn't it? Plus they're in Spanish.
Yeah, right. So I had to translate it to Spanish for the year 10 students, and that's
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're late secondary students, but it had to be administered in their home language for
I
most
was
of
just
them, which would
I
be
was just
Spanish.
reinforcing the point of being able to adapt it. That's a really
Yeah.
important thing because, for example, we had to over many, as that chapter in knowledge building about this
Mm,
says, we had to adapt it ourselves quite a lot because we thought the word practice would mean something to do with like skills and no, we thought it was to do with sort of like kind of like a kind of snowery kind of practice, engaging with other people. And then the mathematicians said, "Oh no, we do loads of practice," and they meant a sort of knowledgey version
right.
of practice. So we had to get rid of the bloody word practice, because it meant two totally different things to these different people in different
Mm.
disciplines. So I'm just encouraging this notion of like adapting these sorts of um, sort of conceptual ideas.
Yeah, yeah, thank you, Carl. So what I ended up with is similar but different because most of the items stayed the same except the one for interactional relations, which now rather than getting a feel for something is learning to think like an ideal knower, which changes according to the subject by interacting with them or their works. And then the other big adaptation that I made was according to my thesis supervisor, Ana Linares, her suggestions. So she said that we should exemplify each of these items to make them more accessible for the students so they could have a better idea of what uh, content theory and concepts might look like in each subject, what learning to think like an English speaker by interacting with their works might look like in these subjects. And then she also suggested that we ask the students to actually justify their answers to the question. And so this is what the result of that process was for English, geography and history, and biology and geology. All of the questions are the same, just that the examples are adapted to the subject in question. So previously at LCT5, I showed the very beginning of the analysis of this data. I showed the measures of central tendency, so the mean and the median, for teachers and students' responses to each of these items. Because these questionnaires were administered to both groups, teachers were asked about the subject that they taught, and students were asked about the subjects that they took. So all three for students, and then only the subject that they taught for teachers. And I plotted the mean scores for each of the items. Well, the combination of the items, because epistemic relations is comprised of ontic and discursive, and social relations of interactional and subjective. Um, and so I plotted the mean scores on the specialization plane and compared the results following the same methodology that Carl and Sarah Howard outline in their chapter of just subtracting the mean for each subject from a grand mean to see where they would sit on the specialization plane relative to each other. Now, what I found was that in terms of teachers' perceptions, which is here on the left, the teachers actually clearly situated each of the subjects in its own area, right? So biology is clearly a relativist code, history is somewhere between knowledge and elite code, and English is a knower code. And these findings were really similar to what Carl and Sarah found for their subject areas, where except that they used mathematics instead of history, but science and English were in similar positions for the teachers. For the students, on the other hand, they perceive the epistemic relations of each subject as basically the same, which is why there's virtually no difference in their position on the y-axis for epistemic relations, because they didn't perceive very many differences between them at all. However, they did perceive big differences in the social relations of each of the subjects. So for them, history had very weak social relations, biology a bit stronger, but still weak. And then English had very strong social relations. So what my next question was, why are students perceiving differences in subject social relations only? And that's what I'm going to be talking about in this roundtable. So here I'm looking at the justifications that they provided for their selections in this little short response at the bottom of the question.
Leah, it was just a quick question. Your student groups, where you're looking at the different subject areas,
Mhm.
is this sometimes the same students taking different subjects through the medium of English, or are they all different student groups? Is it the
They're
same students responding to biology and history and other subjects?
Yes, it's all the
Okay.
same students. So the 772 students responded to each of the questions, to English, to biology, and to history.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Because they take all of those subjects, so they were able to answer those questions. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about in this roundtable is my thematic coding of their short responses for that justification. The comparison across subjects. So I'm going to say what turned out to be the results for each of these subjects. And then finally, I'm going to be giving some special attention to the history subject, which ended up becoming the focus of my dissertation after this kind of general study focusing on all of the questionnaire data. All right. So here are my thematic codes, looking a bit chaotic, but I started here on the right with the paraphrase of the students' responses. So the very first thing that I did was to read all of the responses for all of the subjects and to just kind of see what students were saying in general. Then my next step was to go through all of those responses again and to paraphrase what the students had actually said. So these 54 codes here on the right, they have a direct link to what the students wrote in their responses. And then my next step was to abstract a level and to say, okay, so what does this mean? How can they be grouped together? What are they actually doing in those responses? So then I ended up with 17 codes. And then I abstracted another level and I ended up with 5 very general codes, again, grouping together different codes from the specific focus. So what this tells me at a glance, or tells us at a glance, is that students did one of 3 main things in their general focus. Most students highlighted one of the Likert items, meaning that they picked one of the Likert items, or 2, or all of them, and they said why they thought it was important or not important to do well in the subject. That's the first one here. Then the second thing that they did was to highlight linguistic proficiency. So their linguistic proficiency in English. In the English subject, this manifested as the students saying their linguistic proficiency goal for English, the level that they believed that they needed to have to do well in the subject. And then in the content subjects, it manifested as the students saying how they believed their linguistic proficiency or their level in English related to their performance in the subject. Then the last major thing that they did was to highlight strategies for learning. So rather than to pick on one of the Likert items and say why it was important or wasn't important, they said what they believed they actually had to do without making explicit reference to one of the items from the question. And then there was also another category. Very few responses actually fell into this, but they couldn't be categorized into any of the above. And there was an omitted category where we'll see in more detail in a second. Students' responses had to be omitted for a number of reasons. So moving from left to right, this would tell me, for example, when students highlight one or more of the Likert items, which ones are they focusing on, and what does that focus look like in each subject in terms of the descriptive codes here on the right? And this gives me an idea about their understanding of the basis of achievement in each subject. So let's move into the results. In terms of the general focus, that's those 5 codes that were there on the left-hand column. The first thing that stuck out to me is that 250 responses, which is almost a third of the responses, had to be omitted from the analysis in each subject. Here's the breakdown for history, and what we can see is that a small percentage of students chose not to respond to the question. They just didn't feel like it. But most of the responses that were omitted were too vague, meaning that the students said, oh, because I say so, because I think so, because that's what my experience was. Or they just reiterated their Likert selections without adding any additional justification. So they were too vague to be categorized. Then the other thing that happened is that some students responded in a way that was off topic. So rather than saying why the items that they had selected were important to do well in the subject, they would write why the subject was important for their lives or for their future, which is a different issue entirely. So what that suggests to me is that this question may have been too conceptually challenging for year 10 students and that it maybe needed to be presented in a different way, or they needed to have some kind of guidance as they were actually filling out the questionnaire. Even so, there are still plenty of patterns that emerge from the responses that were not omitted from analysis. In terms of general focus, what we can see is that most of the students highlighted a Likert item to say why it was important or not important for the subject, which makes sense given the task at hand. Then in the English subject, another big chunk of students highlighted their linguistic proficiency, so the level that they think that they had to have in order to do well in the subject, which again also makes sense, and that played a smaller role in biology and history. And then finally, we can notice that in history, a huge percentage of students highlighted strategies for learning rather than the Likert items. This is something that they paid more attention to in history than other subjects for reasons that we are going to understand now as we move into the specific focus. So for the specific focus, that's that middle column, we can start with the subject of English. And what I see when I look at the English results is that it's a very nicely balanced pie chart compared to the other one. So all of the codes kind of have a little bit of space there. That's because I think a big chunk of the responses for English said that all of the Likert items corresponding to each of the relations in the 4K model were similarly important to do well in the subject. Then at the same time, something that came up in this subject and other subjects is that students emphasizing individual attributes, which includes talent, but also other things that the students associated with talent, such as their affective dispositions towards the subject, so whether or not they liked it, enjoyed it, how they felt about the subject, as well as their background, their social background in some cases, when they said that in English, you had to have been hearing English all the time since you were a small child in order to do well. So in terms of individual attributes, they were emphasized and downplayed to similar extents, right? So it was sort of contested, the role of talent, the role of individual attributes. Some students were saying, oh, these are really important to do well. Other students were saying, no, those aren't important at all. All you have to do is work hard and you'll be fine. Then content knowledge was also often emphasized, and when it was emphasized, students said that the content knowledge was basic or foundational, meaning that knowing the grammar and vocabulary was necessary to be able to do other things that they also considered important in the subject. So you needed to know the grammar and the vocabulary in order to be able to write a text or to have a conversation or to engage in any skills or interactions with ideal knowers that they also viewed as important. For example, one student writes that content knowledge is important because without the foundation of grammar, you're in trouble. And another student writes that it's important because without the theory, it's really difficult to read, write, or even have a conversation. Then another big chunk in the English subject is interaction with the ideal knower, which in the case of English are native and highly proficient speakers. These responses, when they occurred, were evenly divided between different descriptive codes, such as becoming like a native speaker, learning from native speakers, practicing from native speakers, and immersing oneself in native speakers' work. For example, one student writes, I've never studied English in my life and I don't plan to. Studying English with books is the biggest waste of time in the world. Watching series, reading books, talking to native speakers, and liking the language is what really makes the difference. And another student writes, learning to think like a native is the key to knowing how to speak properly. So there was a big a big emphasis on nativeness and interaction with native speakers in the case of English. And as I mentioned earlier, students also often highlighted their linguistic proficiency goal for the subject, as well as active learning strategies, which included things like manipulating the language in some way, using it in some way, doing an activity, writing a text, but some kind of productive skill rather than simply studying from the textbook. And if we remember that epistemic relations comprises both content and skills, and social relations comprises both individual attributes and interaction with ideal knowers, then we can see that in the English subject, both of these are emphasized. So in the short responses, there are stronger epistemic relations and also stronger social relations, which lines up with what we saw in the quantitative analysis earlier, where English epistemic relations were on par with other subjects, but social relations were much stronger. Now, moving to biology, the picture is quite different because those elements that were associated with social relations earlier, so interaction with the ideal knower, emphasis on individual attributes, and all being similarly important, are now much smaller than they were in English. And what comes up as important now is especially content knowledge. Students are highlighting this and saying that it's one of the most important things. And within that, in the descriptive codes, they're saying that concepts and vocabulary are important for biology, and comprehension of concepts is important for biology as well. For example, one student writes that it's important to have a good control over new terms or names because they're words that we don't usually use. Another student writes, biology is a subject where you have to understand all the content, not just study it. Another student writes, it's important to understand the theory so that you can then understand other things, since in biology, everything is related. And then skills also come up a lot in biology. And when students emphasize skills, which often they emphasize together with content knowledge, they said that content was a prerequisite for the skills. So you had to kind of know the content first, but then the skills were going to be what was evaluated because the skills were an application of the content knowledge. And they also said that skills involving informed reasoning were important. So we can see that in this example where one student writes, you need a balance between what you have to study and what you have to do to apply those concepts. For example, you can't read a karyotype if you don't know the theory of that topic. And then another student writes, once you're able to draw conclusions and at least get an idea of topics you haven't studied, you can master the subject. So you have to be able to kind of infer things from data and then also apply your knowledge to other new topics. And then finally, rote learning strategies where students were emphasizing memorization and simply studying the content of the textbook come up more in biology than in English. For example, one student says, you really don't need to have any skills or to understand what the biologists of the time thought, since to get good grades, the only thing you need to know is how to memorize. So again, if we remember that epistemic relations comprises content and skills, and social relations, individual attributes and interaction, we can see that here, epistemic relations remain strong, arguably stronger, and social relations are weaker because those elements that were associated with social relations are now occupying smaller pieces of the pie. And then finally, our last subject is history. So moving into history, we see that again, the elements that are reflecting social relations are still small, like individual attributes and everything being similarly important. And now skills is a smaller piece of the pie as well. What comes up as important is content knowledge, but students are divided about what elements of content knowledge are important. So they write that it's concepts and vocabulary, that it's events and setting, that it's theory, that it's basic or foundational to be able to do other things, that it's evaluated, that it's just important in general, that it's accurate, that you need to comprehend it. They're kind of all over the place in their description of content in history. For example, one student writes that it's important to know the vocabulary needed to deal with the topics of this subject, and another that it's super important to know the events and when they happen, since that's what history is about. And another that learning the content theory and concepts of geography and history is the most important thing you need to know when taking because that's when taking the exam, that's what you need to know is the content. And then finally, we have a big emphasis on more rote learning strategies where when these were highlighted, 70% of students said that memorizing the information was important. So 70% within this big chunk of the pie, I mean. For example, one student writes that the ones I have put as unimportant is because history is simply about memorizing and then putting it on the exam. Another that there's no need to reflect on the facts, there are events on a specific date. And another that it's necessary to learn the concepts by heart. The practical part is not so important because the information is what it is. And then the same as in the other subjects, if epistemic relations are content and skills, social relations, individual attributes and interaction, we see that Like in biology, students are placing more emphasis on the epistemic relations and less on the social.
Leah, can I just ask why you're using a pie? Because I find it very hard to read. So many parts to it.
Why I'm using a pie?
Yeah, because I find it visually very hard to compare.
What would you suggest instead?
Well, anything but a pie, because you'll be asking us to compare about what, 12 different colors,
Um, yeah, I mean,
all of which are varying from pie to pie. So just in terms of
well,
visualization, I'm thinking
yeah,
in
I mean
order
the
to be able
colors
to
are
get
this,
the knowledge across,
yeah.
whatever it is you're trying to get across, I was just wondering why you used a pie, because I'm finding it so visually dense to try and follow. I'm following what you're saying as you go along, but I'm
Hmm.
just wondering about the visualizations as a useful rhetorical device because it's uh yeah, comparing pies to pies are very hard
Okay, I
because
will
there's
keep
so
that in
many moving
mind.
parts. Is it possible to like, I mean, look, could you have different like sizes of a bar graph or something, or does it have to be percentages of a thing, or
I mean, it is percentages of a thing because it all adds up to 100, right? They account for all of the
yeah?
responses that weren't eliminated.
I'm
Um,
just wondering. So if you could put them, then when you go, I'm following along perfectly well, but I'm just thinking in terms of
hmm
visualization. I always think
hmm
it's really important that we. So one of the things that I hate more than anything is people who use piss poor Venn diagrams that aren't for any reason at all except having three circles. And you see that a lot in educational research where they have like three circles and three words on, well, word on each circle or something. And they're like misusing the capacity for diagrams to convey. But I'm just thinking here, it's quite hard, unless it's just me.
hmm
I find it quite hard. If you bounce between the three of them, it's quite hard to follow the number of variables that are changing all at once, except beyond how big blue, something really big obviously is. So I was
hmm
just wondering whether a way that might make it more visually comparative would be something like different bars or something like that, where you
hmm
could be able to stack them and see, oh
Yeah,
yeah, I
like
can
a
see that
stacked bar chart.
yeah, that one's gone up a lot, that one's gone down a lot, and so on. Whereas
Hmm
when you've got a pie chart, you're being asked to compare, I don't know how many different things changing at once. So 12 or something, 3,
hmm
9, 13, I think. So yeah, it's quite hard to do 13 in your head. It's just a suggestion for
Okay,
being able
yeah,
to
no,
get
that's
your
helpful.
ideas
Thanks.
across. Maybe I'm the only
Yeah.
person and everybody's able to read by charts that easily, but I'd like to be able to look across them and think, oh yeah, blue's really gone up,
Yeah,
but
no, I
oh,
think
brown hasn't, you know?
yeah, no, that makes sense. I think I presented it in this way because I was focusing on one subject at a time, but I definitely
Yeah.
agree that when we're comparing across all the subjects, it would be helpful to have each bar for one subject, or like a stacked bar chart, kind
Yeah,
of.
yeah, that way then you'd be able to see, because you want to be able to compare them because it really is about comparative strengths.
Yeah,
Like to say something is stronger really means it's stronger than other. So stronger epistemic relations is stronger than other epistemic relations.
right.
So I mean, what I mean by that is when you say there are stronger epistemic relations, you're saying epistemic relations are emphasized more strongly than they are for other subjects.
Yes.
Yes, not compared to SR. So it'd be useful if you can compare them across subjects somehow. And I just find pies, much as I like eating them, I find them very hard to visualize data on them. That's all.
Okay, yeah,
Well,
no,
Joe
thank you.
finds them
That's
very easy
helpful.
to follow, but well, I don't. I use myself
Uh,
as a canary in the mine of someone who's very lazy and therefore needs to be spoon-fed information.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I think they might even be complementary. As I'm going into the details of one subject, I could use a pie perhaps, and then as I'm ma
I
focusing
would
more on the
minimize it.
comparisons.
Minimize what you show. That's what I would suggest.
Okay.
So, no, I'm thinking when you write it up, that's all.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. When you stack them as well, when you want to say, look, it's stronger or weaker. But even if you don't stack them, you go from slide to slide to slide or from position to position. That's why we use the planes so that we can see from plane to plane to plane. We can then mentally see where something is different to something else. Which is by the way, everybody, why you never lengthen or shorten the axes of a plane. Never. They're always symmetrical. So just so everybody remembers that, because then we always have a visualization of where something is on the plane we can compare to something else.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful feedback, especially for when I'm writing and presenting results later. It's definitely good to hear this now rather than later. I appreciate that. Um, right. So if we now look across the subject areas, where here a stacked bar chart would work very nicely, but I haven't done it here either. We can look at how the relations are represented in each of the subjects. So Ontic relations, referring to knowledge of content theory and/or concepts, were often highlighted as important in all three subjects, as we've just seen, even though that was the case to different degrees in each of the subjects, because students' focus was more varied for English and more on different learning strategies for history. And then at the same time, as we saw in the descriptive codes, different aspects of content knowledge were highlighted in each subject. So in English, content knowledge was perceived as the basis for other skills and interactions. In biology, it was perceived as concepts and terms that needed to be learnt, comprehended, and applied. And in history, it was perceived as concepts, events, and settings to be memorized. In terms of discursive relations or skills and procedures, these were highlighted as important in biology for 15% of students, many of whom saw skills and procedures as a means of applying or reasoning about the content knowledge, but these were not often singled out in the short responses for English or history. In terms of subjective relations, which as I mentioned earlier includes natural talent, but also background and effective dispositions, these were contested in all three subjects because when they were mentioned, they were emphasized just about as often as they were downplayed as unimportant. And then finally, for interactional relations or getting a feel for the subject, these were perceived differently between English and content subjects, where they were often emphasized in English, but in biology and history, they were almost exclusively downplayed when mentioned at all. So these interactional relations seem to be really what's influencing the difference in the perceived strength of social relations in English as compared to other subjects for students, which we can now visualize here, right? Returning to this specialization plane from earlier, we see that for students, for these students anyway, in order to do well in history, you need to learn by heart a set of events, terms, and their settings in time and space. So that would help explain the weaker social relations here because it's just learning by heart, which doesn't involve much reasoning or even interpretation on behalf of the learner. Then for these students in biology, to do well, you need to understand, connect, and apply complex concepts, which does involve a bit more of informed reasoning, so slightly stronger social relations, although still weak. And then finally, for English, to do well, you need to learn vocabulary and grammar while becoming as native-like as possible. So epistemic relations remain strong, but these interactional relations are really stressed to the point of influencing the score for social relations, making them much stronger than the other two subjects. Okay, so what really stuck out to me in all of this analysis was history, right? Because there were over 100 students who responded that all history was just memorizing. Memorizing, no need to interpret, no need to understand, no need to think about values, just cram the book and that's it, as one student writes. But wait, for those of us who know anything about education and history, even if students aren't seeing them, history is written from certain perspectives and with certain values. So from systemic functional linguistics perspective, for example, which is the other main theoretical framework that I'm using in my dissertation, factual writing is never completely objective, but rather it portrays an individual or a collective interpretation of reality that can be made more or less explicit.
Leah,
Yeah,
can I just say that is also the starting point of anyone in history and anyone in sociology about history.
okay, fair.
Anyone in social science would say that about history,
Fair,
I
thank
would
you.
say.
And in school history, students are expected to construe perspectives that align with those of relevant historians by using language in discipline-specific ways. One theory within systemic functional linguistics that's been used to pinpoint those linguistic resources that characterize evaluation in history is the appraisal theory, which is just illustrated here on the right, although we won't get into that today. And what appraisal theory does is to help identify linguistic systems that are used to portray speakers' and writers' attitudes and assessments and to align addressees with their perspectives. So it tells us how students or how anyone, any writer, is evaluating something and how they're getting us to agree with them. And what research with appraisal has shown is that the expression of values in history texts actually changes throughout secondary school. So it's not the same in early secondary as it is in later secondary. In early secondary, emotions are more explicitly inscribed. So they'll, for example, use empathetic tasks that focus on individual actors, as we can see in this example on the right, which is a text that I've borrowed from Derewianka 2007, where a student has been asked to write a diary entry from the perspective of a young girl in Nazi Germany and has very clearly inscribed her emotions in that text. But then in later secondary, we notice a move towards institutionalized emotions where they're portrayed as assessments of events and behaviors, which makes subjectivity less visible for students. For example, we have a late secondary text here from the same paper where a student has been asked to evaluate the extent to which individuals can be considered responsible for the rise of Hitler to power. And the student has evaluated Hitler as charismatic, as a creator, as playing a key role. So really emphasizing his importance and some of his qualities, but not inscribing their emotions in a direct way. So students are expected to align their perspectives with those of relevant historians, but the problem is that they're not typically taught how to use language for these purposes in their content subjects, in CLIL contexts or in other contexts. So the implication for equity, and this is kind of to sum up what I've been saying and to show how it connects with what I'll continue to do with my thesis, is that if these shifts towards assessments of events and behaviors are not made explicit, students might have trouble recognizing or expressing values in history texts. For example, they might view interpretations of history as just facts to memorize because the information is what it is, just events on a specific date, as the students in my study have written. And this phenomenon might disproportionately affect students who aren't familiar enough with the right values to pick up on them implicitly. So for example, students from socioculturally or socioeconomically marginalized backgrounds who simply haven't been familiarized enough with the dominant culture to pick up on it implicitly. Because as Martin writes, only students from the right background are positioned to learn by osmosis what has to be learned, but is never made explicit. So what can we do about it? And this is where I'm moving with my thesis now. If success in school history depends on assessing events and behaviors, and students wish that it involved less rote learning, as they've said in my questionnaire study, why don't we guide them through identifying and expressing values in their own texts? And I'm not the first person to propose this. There are people in this very Zoom room who have also proposed this in their articles. But I think that what I'm finding in my study kind of supports that move. So in the CLIL context, collaborations between English teachers and history teachers, for example, could use or adapt Rose and Martin's 2012 teaching and learning cycle to help students identify evaluative language in assigned texts. And this is an example that comes from a text recommended by the British Council curriculum, so that this is something that students would be expected to read. And to then co-construct texts with students by helping them create lists and then create texts using those lists of evaluative language to construct their own texts. And then finally, to better support students' independent construction of texts when they are asked to do this. So this is an example of a very successful text from the larger research project, which my thesis study is a part of, where a student used evaluative language quite well. And this next step in my thesis is actually to see how students are encoding values in these history texts when they are not taught to do so, but asked to by the prompt. So that is all From me, I would love to open the floor for questions, comments.
I think maybe I just missed. You said a bit earlier that the students wish that history had less rote learning. Maybe I didn't catch it, but it's quite clear that they possibly think history involves a lot of rote learning. All those quotes that are on the slide. Did you find evidence there in their responses that they wish it wasn't as well, or did I miss that?
I didn't get into that just for the sake of time, and I guess I should have mentioned something before I included that in the conclusions. But yeah, no, there were students that said, I think history is taught horribly. All I have to do is remember information for the exam. If it involved something more interactive, something where I was doing something more than memorizing, then I think I would like it more. There were several responses to that degree, and I'll talk about that in my thesis definitely, but for reasons of time and space, it wasn't included here.
So you think it's how it's taught? I mean, like, for example, one of the things can be, like, for example, I've in the University of Sydney is allowed in more and more percentage of international students, primarily from China. And they are proving the value of Rainbow Chen's PhD, which was the first PhD in LCT, funny enough, which analysed the dispositions brought by Chinese students to Australian universities, in which they see and anticipated and expected knowledge transmission in a highly top-down way, and rote learning, and thought of knowledge as the collection of facts into a bag, as it were. And this is what I'm now experiencing as I'm teaching. In fact, I'm marking at the moment, not the second, but this week. And it's playing out more and more that the dispositions they're bringing. But you're thinking, you're thinking that it's actually the teaching that's also encouraging this. I mean, it could be both, not just that the students. I mean, your students come from a range of backgrounds, do they? So they're not just bringing quite uniform dispositions.
I mean, they come from most of them come from Spain and from the Spanish education system, which, I mean, there are people here who will be able to talk more about that than I will. But the Spanish education system in general has received some criticism for being very focused on giving you the knowledge that you need and for being very traditional, especially considering the history of Spain, which was in a dictatorship until the late 70s, early 80s. So it's something that some have written is a very traditional educational system in that way.
Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, but I think one of the things is here is that they're saying that subject is about, being rote learning and not the others. So it suggests it's not just the dispositions they're bringing, but the way in which they're being taught.
Yeah.
Can I ask an extension question from that, which is, do you have any sort of understanding of if the teachers are aware of this and if they're trying to move away from that, and how their students see that subject, especially history, as this rote learning and memorization? Is there an awareness with the practitioners that actually it needs to be not even seen by the students like that?
I am not sure that I have the answer to this question, but Anna or Tom, you would know more than I would.
Yes, well, in fact, these CLIL programs that have become really big in Spain, and particularly in Madrid, where our project is based on, they have sort of made a difference in terms of how teachers perceive the teaching of history. But it's true that it's particularly history and the social sciences that traditionally in Spain has been taught with a very sort of, factual oriented approach. But the first programs that started, which were a joint venture between the British curriculum and the Spanish curriculum, they brought a different angle to the way of studying history. So it's precisely in these CLIL programs where we see teachers who are doing, well, quite a lot in changing that perspective. And in fact, there is a recent doctoral thesis within our group by a history teacher who has taught both, in a sort of ordinary program and in a CLIL program. And she's looked at that need, right? The perspective of looking at history from a more critical sort of evaluative approach is done. I just wanted to ask Leah, because I need to leave in a minute. I have another meeting, sorry. And it was really interesting to see in your results that that the students, even though they are participating, they've participated, most of them, in a CLIL program, bilingual education program for all their school lives, they still don't give any relevance to the role of language. I understand language as a goal, no, in biology and history, because language as a goal is the objective of an English subject, but not even language as a tool for the subject. So that means that something is not really working in terms of teachers showing the students how important language is to be able to, to work well in their disciplines. I mean, here we're talking about a second language like English or foreign language or X language, but this also applies to whatever language, also their first language or their whatever you want to call it. So something has to be done there, and I think it's something that to highlight in the discussion of your results in terms of a pedagogical implication. So it is a CLIL program, language is not. So have you looked at that in the teachers questionnaires?
I haven't gotten there yet. I've been overwhelmed with student questionnaires, but yeah, no, that's a great point. And it is something that I mentioned in my abstract, but didn't get to here, which is that students, they mention their language proficiency goal in the English subject, but for content subjects, they mention it only very briefly. And the gist of what they say is that if your English level isn't high enough, like your general English level, not your subject-specific English level, then you won't be able to do well in the subject. And the other thing that they say is that the studying these subjects improves their English level, right? But they're not aware of what linguistic resources, what kind of language they might need to do well in these subjects specifically, and how that might be different from their general English.
Thank you.
Can I just double check, Leah? Maybe I wasn't listening properly, but with the English, is that sort of EFL type English, or is that subject English?
It's very much EFL type English.
Okay.
As far as I know, and as far as I've worked in schools, what they teach in the English classes is very separated in most cases from the content subjects, which is unfortunate because it mainly focuses on, I don't know, daily routines, things that you might need to know if you traveled to the UK, right? Interactions like this, traditional grammar, writing texts, writing essay type texts, but not anything that prepares them for doing history through English or doing science through English. And that's something that the research group led by Ana Llinares, who is just speaking, I think she's just left though, is working on a lot with teachers, is to help integrate the English subject with the content subjects and kind of create collaborations between English specialists and content specialists so that they can prepare their students for these writing tasks that happen in the content subjects using their English language skills.
Yeah, I mean, that would seem huge. I mean, that seems like a massive opportunity there. You've got a kind of dedicated curriculum that is not, I mean, that's where students could be reflecting on how language in biology is different from history and so on. I mean, that seems like a sort of a key site where something really transformational could happen.
Yeah, I agree.
It also, I don't like encouraging people to do too much in terms of concepts. So sometimes the less concepts, the better. People often obsess about using lots and lots of theory. But at some point in the future, what you just described sounds like an autonomy analysis to me. When you have two things coming together, like English and the subject.
Tom and Merve have done some work with autonomy in CLIL, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so you can see whether one thing is serving another or not, so whether it actually is being served, because sometimes you could get like the English. So is it what is the primary goal, by the way? Maybe I completely have forgotten that, but is it to learn English, to learn the subject, or to learn both?
That's a tough question. Right. So I mean, it depends on who you ask, but yeah, the CLIL was initially implemented because of this 2+1 policy that was established by the European Union in the late 90s, where students would learn 2 additional languages in addition to their mother tongue, right? So it was a way of getting students more exposure to a foreign language and helping them use it in a more practical way, let's say, so that they would see more of a need to use the language than just for their EFL class and talking about hypothetical scenarios where they go to the UK or whatever. So if I understand correctly, and again, there are people who are more experts in this than I am in this room here with us, then the idea was to get the students to see to use the language productively, practically, get them more exposure to the language. And that was kind of why it was initially implemented in Spain, also because Spain's foreign language results have always been so poor, which is kind of why CLIL took off particularly strongly in Spain, so to say. But of course, they do also need to learn the content subjects, right? So it needs to not take away from their content learning, which is important for their futures, for their university entrance exams, etc. So it needs to be both.
Leah, could I ask a question about your translation device? I'm interested in the ER side of things, so your ontic relations and your discursive relations. I don't think you showed the translation device, but so you've characterized OR as content and DR as skills and procedures broadly. So for content, how do you articulate that? Is that subject as content, or is it subject or language as content? Is it both?
So I don't really have a translation device for my thematic coding because it is just thematic coding. The translation device is kind of built into that Likert item that Carla and Sarah originally designed, right? And when I was doing the thematic coding of the short responses, it was very clear to me that students were picking up one of the items and saying, okay, this is important because, this is not important because, right? So that's how I could say that they were emphasizing ontic relations or emphasizing discursive relations, etc., because they had picked up on the Likert item that was meant to represent ontic relations or discursive relations and saying why it was or wasn't important. But to answer your question about ontic relations and what that content refers to, it refers to the content in the subject, right? So in history, it would be the events that they're asked to learn about, their setting in time, their setting in space, any historical actors they're asked to learn about. That would be the content of the subject, right? Because if language about history was integrated into the history curriculum, then that could also be considered part of the content of the subject, but at the moment that isn't the case.
Okay, so you're not currently differentiating per se between whether or not, if you think about it like that sort of vase illusion diagram that's black and white, that do you know the one I mean? If you focus in one way you see the vase, if you focus in another way you see two faces. That's kind of how I think about the relationship between content and language in a classroom, right? That pedagogically, a teacher can make the decision to focus on the content, or they can sort of shift that into the background and they can focus on the language. And the teacher sort of is constantly making, if you've got both of those things in your mind, the teacher is making those decisions at different points. Do I focus on the subject? Do I focus on the language? So, in a future when perhaps you're working with teachers and you bring in SFL prisms and you've got co-constructed learning and so on, and there's more of a focus on the language and how it functions to express the discipline. I don't know what my question is, but so you're not sort of differentiating between those two at the moment. It could be one, it could be other.
Yeah, no, not at the moment. I mean, language comes into play as discipline-specific terms being content, sure, but I don't think that in CLIL programs in Spain at the moment, there is enough emphasis on discipline-specific language use beyond just terminology to actually include that as the content of the subject.
Sure, yeah, okay. So anything around kind of writing or assessment, or how people take this subject knowledge and then reproduce it in some form. Does that end up being part of discursive relations then? That's the skills to represent their subject knowledge.
Yeah, I would say so. One of the problems that it is often observed in CLIL in Spain is that students don't write very much. They're more often encouraged to speak and use their speaking skills in English to talk about the content knowledge than to actually write. But yeah, if they're asked, writing a text, for example, in the English subject is mentioned as one of the examples in discursive relations. And in interpreting maps and graphs, for example, is one of the discursive relations for history and geography. So that whether you're interpreting that in written format or in spoken format, that would be part of discursive relations. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So Leah, I want to just pick up on your study. I know you've got so many different parts of the studies and how it all comes together. But in another part of your study, you were very interested in the perceptions of teachers and students at like working class or schools for like lower income schools and higher income schools, and you were comparing that. This survey data, do you distinguish at all between the responses between the schools, the two different schools? And if, have you got there yet? And if so, just can you talk to us a little bit about what your findings show?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So yes, this is kind of the unifying thread throughout my work, is how content and language integrated learning happens and how students experience it in different social class areas. So as Lee knows, because she was very much involved in supervising the more qualitative aspect of my thesis, I was looking a lot at that when I was looking at teacher and student interviews. And I do also look at it in this questionnaire data, but I'm not quite there yet because my first step was to get all of the coding done for everybody regardless. And then I'll actually be able to make associations between students that are attending schools with more resources versus schools with fewer resources.
Thanks.
Anyone else got anything they want to ask? Or can we let Leah go off and start planning and getting ready for her birthday? How old are you tomorrow, Leah?
29.
29, is that all? I think my iPhone is older than me.
God, I wish I knew this much about SFL and LCT at 29.
Well, when I was 29, LCT didn't exist.
Yeah, well, likewise.
Really? Or did it? Hang on. Sorry, I'm going to have to do some maths on when I was 29. No, I don't know if it did. No, it did. The earliest bits of it did. Yes, I think the earliest bits of it were written when I was 25, actually. So there you go. Thank you so much, Leah. The silent dooms Zoom clapping thing, which is always a bit strange, but everybody can wave their hands. Thanks, Leah, very much. And thanks everybody for being here. And I hope to see you in a couple of weeks' time. And keep us appraised of how you're doing, Leah, on the forum and so on.